Okay. Thanks to all of you for this incredible panel. We'll open it up. Renuka, I see your placard up.
Thank you, Lou, and great presentations by the panelists. And I talk from personal experience. I'm with Becton Dickinson, so we have a lot of devices and diagnostics that go through the PQS and whatnot. Really great to see the progress made, and Dan, your presentation on timelines and WHO's response is great. Good to note the harmonization efforts. I was in a meeting recently with an industry forum where a company presented that they had to do 62 trials after getting a PQS approval. From a BD perspective, I can tell you we got a PQS approval for a product. 15 months later, 11 studies more to be done, and that product is also FDA approved. So it is still not resolved, and I don't want us to celebrate prematurely. I think the efforts of your groups are certainly the reason we're making progress. I want to know the panelists' view on a challenge that's being faced in global health. On one hand, we have agencies, donors, funders, asking companies, and we heard that on the panel yesterday through Chai, to say, please provide access pricing because you are serving the world's most vulnerable populations. And companies are responding, rightly so, and should respond. And these are arguably products that are PQS approved and registered. The same hand we have, on the other side, we have WHO asking companies to say, pay us 1% of your sales revenues to strengthen our PQS group so that we can actually more effectively go get your products to the PQS system. Now, how that is not perceived as a conflict of interest, I don't know. But we're all here trying to solve a global health issue. And I just want to know the views of panelists. What's your reaction and response? Industry does have a position on this, but I'm curious to know yours and any guidance on how you can make this more collaborative such that when we're doing global health, we're not doubly penalized.
Sure, I'll take that on a little bit here. So I'll comment first on what you said about having to do studies after registration, and to be honest with you, it breaks all of the rules that we have in terms of how do we create impact in the shortest period of time with the least amount of human and financial resources. And I think that we need to really look closely at that whole system. And that typically isn't a regulatory issue. It's more of a policy issue in the countries. And I think I would love to, and I've been pushing for a study to show when you do those extra 60 studies, what additional information was learned. And my guess is it's very little. And I think that until we start to question these types of behaviors, I think that it will continue to occur. And it's one of the things that I am looking into, and I know others are looking into as well. The real question I think that you asked was around the 1% of sales, and I can tell you a little bit about that. First off, speaking for the Gates Foundation, we have no opinion on how this should work. That said, we likely instigated the whole concept of PQ looking for additional funding. And right now, the Gates Foundation is the largest funder of PQ, and one of the things that we are talking about is sustainability. And I think if you're relying strictly on donor funding, the sustainability can certainly be called into question. So as part of our grant, we've asked the world, or the PQ system, to think about ways that they could create a more sustainable financial system for themselves. So they've worked with, I believe it was McKinsey, to look at a variety of different options, and I know that they had several options. They put out some draft information on that, and have received a variety of different types of feedback, some positive, some negative. I know that they'll be deciding this in the next short period, but it's purely their decision. I don't really know which way they're leaning right now.
I would echo Dan's comments on the need for sustainability. This was always an issue of debate when you have a core capability that you're expecting WHO to have in place, having that be reliant upon a nonprofit foundation's contributions year over year is not sustainable. At least it's not the level of sustainability and predictability that the issue deserves. So there has to be an approach to that, and I won't comment on what mechanism. I think that still needs to be agreed. With regard to pricing, I've been on both sides of this, and I think that it is hopefully increasingly seen as the community's responsibility to collaborate to determine pricing well in advance of the introduction of products. Now, companies are the ones that own the pricing decision. And I think from our standpoint, at least from Takeda's standpoint, we have thought very carefully about this when it comes to programs in dengue and chikungunya and the partnership with the Gates Foundation. Pricing was prominently featured in those discussions. But if you're going to make your product, if your goal is to make your product available to as many people who need it as possible, which I think should be every company's objective, you need to make decisions early in development around the technology platform that you're using, the manufacturing facilities that you're going to build, and you need to put into your financial models the projected pricing that you would expect in different markets, and that needs to be part of the entire investment case, in my view. And this is what we've done with those programs that I've mentioned inside our organization. And we have found a way to make programs like dengue, which will be a product that is used in all types of markets, not just sustainable, but also competitive from a prioritization standpoint within our company relative to other investments in different therapeutic areas. And I think this is very important within a company, that you take these global health priorities and you find a way to make them sustainable and competitive relative to other ways the company could invest its resources.
So I just want to have a quick response so that we close this discussion, no more than a quick comment. Companies are building sustainability from way up front, years even when the product is in R&D, working with agencies such as Gates and CHAI. So your point that you make is already being actioned, and maybe this is something that we can take up as the actionable framework for the public-private partnership. What is the role of public in addressing this dilemma? Who owns this? And it's a shared responsibility, unresolved, but maybe, Lou, with you, we will like to continue the conversation later on the PQS process.
Thank you. So I see Derek, Dick, and then Joe.
Thanks, Lou. Just a comment first and then a question. I think it's striking that much of the discussion has been on pharmaceutical product development and new pharmaceutical product development. It's sort of almost as if the current pharmaceuticals and vaccines we have there actually wouldn't lead us dramatically to lowering many of the risks that we have. I do think we need to think about what are the regulatory hurdles in place today to actually apply the current pharmaceutical products we have, including vaccines. That's the first question. Second, I was interested in your comments, Dan, about how the reforms you're doing would benefit NCDs, and I couldn't quite see how they could, particularly given that most of the medications on the NCD side are generics and wouldn't require this complex process. It's an issue of access and adherence more than one of new product development. And secondly, much of the progress in NCDs and mental health requires regulatory structures and approaches that don't involve the pharmaceutical industry or pharmaceutical products. They involve other products, everything from food, alcohol, tobacco, IT, software, computing, where we're starting to see we would have the biggest impacts. Which leads me to a piece of work I did and when I was 12. It was 20 years ago, WHO almost. And one of the pieces of work we did was to assess regulatory capacity, very focused on what public health capacity do we have in developing countries around the world. And I think it was the first and only time it was done. It was done with the Sorbonne. And the answer, as you can guess, was that there was virtually no public health law capacity in most of the developing countries of the world. And across Africa, with the exception of Mauritius and South Africa, the answer was almost zero, which meant that when they needed public health law, which you do for all of these other areas, most definitely need competence and strength, you would go to the private sector lawyers who are also obviously servicing the very private sector groups who you're going to be developing regulations to address, leading to some quite complex conflicts of interest. I mention that because your comments on capacity I think were interesting, and I'd love to get a clarification since you also have an investment in tobacco control. And I know with Bloomberg they are starting to address it, but that is a different type of public health law need compared to the very tight regulatory structure that you laid out for new product development. And I don't know whether anybody's ever gone back to ask, have we made any progress over the last 20 years? Where are the public health law people at the table? Where is the investment in strengthening public health law in both academia and in the institutions? I don't think you'll make progress without doing it in academia first, since that's usually the support of it. And yet we've seen quite a lot of progress in human rights law, which seems a natural fit for a lot of this work. Could we be adopting some of it? We've seen it in environmental law, which has spurred a lot of the environmental movement. So I think there are ways we could be borrowing from other sectors to accelerate it. And the last comment maybe we'll talk about later is that I think in addition to the capacity issues, regulatory philosophy, the philosophy of why and how government regulates is also changing. And I think Jürgen gave us a hint of how we're in a very interesting new era where the intent of regulation is not just to solve a social problem, but do it in a way in which you mobilize market forces in a positive way. That's a big shift, certainly in the way I was trained in public health. It was you regulate them, you beat them over the head if they're doing bad things. You don't think about incentivizing or nudging towards better policies, which we now know is probably going to be the way forward.
So maybe Dan, and then Jürgen, you probably have a comment.
Sure. So it didn't come through in the presentation, but your comment about old drugs versus new drugs is very relevant. And the AMRH process, while it has a component to introduce new drugs, the real focus is actually on old drugs. So some of the examples that I used in multinational companies are taking old drugs and actually putting them through the system. And the main focus for what the groups in AMRH are looking at is in fact generics, and thinking through the bioequivalence and what's required for bioequivalence, and in the focus on manufacturing. So most of our work currently is in those areas, and I think that will help from a variety of different reasons, and it will include the non-communicable diseases, which was, I think, the next point that you were trying to make. So, in the mental health area, it's an area that I just can't comment on. I think your points are valid, but it's just something that we're not engaged in. And as it relates to public health law, one of the things I did mention was that in January, the African Union approved this model law. So as part of our work in East Africa, we actually created a legal system that allowed the harmonization process to occur. And that process was approved by the African Union in January. So I think that that's one of the areas that we're currently, or that we have addressed, and I think the team's done a great job on that. And then in terms of regulatory philosophy, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think I've seen a couple of examples, and I think Mexico comes to mind specifically when I think about changes in their regulatory system. and they had an economist lead their pharma regulatory group. And he's like, well, this is important for our economy. And they totally changed. If you, the story of what's happened in the Mexican regulatory agency over the last 5 years is just dramatic. And it really was to, in fact, mobilize the markets and increase competition and have high quality. And when you added those things all together, their manufacturing of pharmaceuticals in Mexico is increasing, the quality of the products is increasing, the price has decreased, and the health of the population will increase. So I think there's a whole regulatory is a lot more than clinical trials and approving drugs, but there's many other benefits, I think, which could affect the Sustainable Development Goals.
Just to build on this, this isn't only true for the pharmaceutical sector, it's true for other areas in development as well, that we see a change in philosophy on how public and private interact. And I really truly believe we're gravitating towards a new model where we work more in partnership rather than in an adversarial role. I can give you a number of examples that have nothing to do with what we just discussed. A very good one is the health of oceans. There's a great issue that we all face with deteriorating ocean health, and there has been a historic, very adversarial relationship between large fishing companies that do all sorts of mean and nasty things, and the NGO community that, you know, is obsessed with protecting species, right? So it was like an impossible impasse. In just a period of 18 months, and again, this is one where we actually played a convening role, we identified what the sweet spot was. What is it that both sides really want? And it isn't about fishing gear, or it isn't about ecology per se, it's about healthy oceans. Both the fishermen and women and the ecologists want healthy oceans. This was what rallied them around the table. And when the conversation shifted from pointing fingers to what can we both sides do to maintain healthy oceans or to improve ocean health, the whole conversation changed. Great. And we had Sylvia Earle sitting at the same table with the CEO of Thai, the largest Thai fishing company, and they jointly issued what I thought was not a lowest common denominator report, but a very thoughtful piece of work that brought the whole agenda forward. Just one example. And I see this in a number of areas, and our partnership with Lou and others around food safety is the same thing. There are those who are the bad guys, and there are those who are trying to do what you very nicely described as in the relationship. But we got to build trust, and I like the 7-point plan that you had put up on trust and clarity and transparency and being gentle and not looking back, but looking forward, and then building on this in a mutual partnership without making the conflict of interest go away. It's not going away, but there is a lot of space where there is no conflict of interest. And I spent 3 hours, and I will stop here, I spent 3 hours with my own ethics committee in the World Bank in Washington to explain to them, and this was on the oceans issue, why it is that we can convene something and accept money from both a public and a private entity into the same trust fund pot to solve a problem, and why this wouldn't constitute a conflict of interest. And we had a debate that, yes, there is conflict of interest, there's also perceived conflict of interest, and then there is no conflict of interest in some cases. And for them, this was a concept they'd never heard of before. Because by definition, everything is a conflict of interest the minute a public and a private entity talk to each other. And we convinced them otherwise. There is common interest in a pre-competitive space where you don't have a conflict of interest situation. We have that in our food safety partnership as well. Why is Mars Corporation or Waters Corporation sitting at the table and talking about stuff that benefits every one of them, but there is nobody individually has more benefit than the others? And I think we need to be much more creative, much more aggressive in pushing this forward.
Dick.
Well, what a fantastic conversation we are having here, because maybe it's alignment of interests that we should be trying to think about. I have been impressed increasingly by the importance of metrics that we've been hearing about for the last couple of days in order to have an impact. And I was especially appreciative, Dan, of your putting the diagnostics, perhaps biomarkers. But I'm wondering if we are coming close to doing what we really need to be doing in terms of tapping the potential for metrics. The whole M-Health conversation. What an opportunity to link health and health outcomes to ministers of finance that we've been talking about. Maybe the alignment of interests, can be enhanced by some of these diagnostics biomarkers, whether we're worried about vaccine-preventable diseases or whether we're worried about recognizing early threats. These all become incredibly relevant, but especially when we are just at the edge of beginning to appreciate the ability to measure the long-term impact, for example, on non-communicable diseases of perhaps some even communicable diseases, or stress, or some of the things that have kept coming up. And so I guess my question is, how can we really do more to develop the metrics that would enable us to really track and make the unassailably convincing arguments that the win-win alignments are far greater and deeper than we appreciate. We can talk about Rajesh Zarmed's, or we can talk about diagnostics, or how to assess the cognitive function of children or the elderly, which are probably not unrelated as we develop the biomarkers and the metabolomics to assess that. So I just think that we're at the cusp of an era of developing tools that could connect a lot more dots than we've adequately thought about. Any thoughts?
Go.
There we go. All right. So I think your point about metrics is great, and one of the things that we're trying to do in a lot of our partnerships is really outline what success looks like with real metrics. So the other aspect that we're trying to move to is, instead of what I call an activity-centric approach, like we're going to do A, B, C, D, E, to a decision-centric approach, is we're going to do A, and then we're going to make a decision to do B, and then we're going to make a decision to do C, and then really drive down specifically into, well, what would make you give a yes or a no decision to move from A to B? And I think if we start employing that approach more consistently, then almost by definition, we're going to start using more metrics.
Joe, and then we'll end with Regina. Thank you.
Thanks. I've been going back and forth about whether to ask my question, but I'm going to ask it. I'd like to ask Mr. Vogel the following. So just shifting gears, we've heard about the sort of the different, more so comprehensive and supportive approach to the regulatory framework. In the food area, I'm just interested in the degree to which, I mean, we always usually think of regulation in food as sort of food safety focused. And I wanted to ask you how much thinking is going into the sort of broader issues of food systems and food security as the regulatory framework is being developed in this area. Because obviously, it's been interesting. We work a lot on food policy here at the New York Academy in New York State, and this sort of issue, obviously food safety is an issue to some degree, but less of an issue. And so the degree to which the community that concerns itself with food and agriculture is concerned about all three things is actually quite gratifying in some ways. And I just wanted to ask you to address that in terms of the role of regulation as far as, bringing those forces together in the thinking that's being developed.
So to respond to your question, a lot of thinking has taken place in just the last 12 to 18 months on this issue. For a long time, and this is again sort of changed philosophy, what Derek brought up earlier. For a long time, we looked at production of food, processing of food, and the value chain and consumption of food as completely different things. We are increasingly convinced that that is a very wrong approach. We need to look at the entirety of the food system. And from our perspective at the World Bank, the global food system needs to deliver three main things. It needs to, of course, feed the world's population every day with a reasonably affordable and healthy meal. It needs to create jobs, and it needs to work for the poor, because this is our mandate. So from our perspective, this is a very big focus. Let's not forget that agriculture and the food system is the largest employer on the planet. It's also the largest asset holder on the planet. And even in very developed countries such as France, the largest employer is the food system. It's not Airbus or other things. When you actually look at it, every cheesemaker, every winemaker, the whole thing, so it's very, very large. Now, the other thing that we need to get out of the food system is sustainability. And we are very, very far away from a sustainable food system at this moment on the planet for a variety of reasons, and I will just mention one or two. The greenhouse gas emissions that come out of the way we produce our food globally are so huge, and that they're about 25%. It's a quarter of all global greenhouse gas emissions are related to the way we produce our food. Unfortunately, the trajectory, it's going in the wrong trajectory. It's not getting better. It's not like in energy or transport. We heard our Norwegian ambassador talk about electric cars. In energy sector, we have solar panels and windmills. We don't have that in agriculture. We still produce our food the same way we always have. We use Stone Age technology. Essentially, we use urea, which was invented in my country, in Germany, in 1906. We still use it today as if there is no tomorrow. Only 60% actually reaches the plant. It's very wasteful, huge footprint issues, etc. So that's the second bucket. And not to forget food waste. You do probably know the number of roughly about how much food we waste on the planet. It's about a third of everything that we produce. No other sector would even come close if you think about it. But what's worse, if the math is correct, if food waste was a country, it would be the third largest emitter of global greenhouse gas emissions after the United States and China. So just think about it. Now that calls in my book for more discussions around what do we need to do to change that. It used to be in the past an ethical issue and a moral issue, how can you throw food away, etc., and people are starving. That's still there. But now on top of it, we have a massive, massive economic and sustainability issue. And we need to heavily invest. But the third bucket, and that's where you're going, is of course it needs to deliver health and nutritional outcomes. And in the past, we in the ag sector have always thought that's somebody else's problem. Well, it's not, right? It clearly is not. So this is something we need to really, really focus on. And then regulation and a conversation about how to have the carrot and stick system work is hugely important. And I believe we're just at the beginning of this. Whether you go into labeling, and we've just began to label. We have, for instance, still no footprint labeling in the food. When you go to the supermarket, you have no idea whether the banana you buy that sits next to the orange there, whether it has 10 times the footprint or it doesn't. Nobody knows. And it's so basic, right? So that needs to happen. And then all sugar, fat, salt content, I mean, all these things are just in the beginning. Is this going to be a struggle? Is this going to be complicated? No doubt about it, but it will happen. And certainly from our perspective, it is an area that we need to talk a lot more about. We have just actually published a very nice booklet on this issue where we pull the whole, it's actually entitled, What Does the Global Food System Need to Do in Order to Deliver Nutritional and Health Outcomes? It was one of the flagship products in our spring meetings this year. And it pulls together a number of things, including the regulatory piece, but we don't have time, so I don't want to take you through all the details. But it's available on the web. You may find it quite interesting, because the thinking has shifted dramatically in that direction.
Thank you, Joe. Regina, we'll wrap it up with Regina's question.
Thank you. And very thought-provoking conversation. I have a question for each of you. Starting at the end, Dan, and without getting into the struggle of new drugs, old drugs, chronic diseases, infectious diseases, at least in malaria, where we have drugs and vector tools, we're facing the specter of what is now being clearly labeled multiple drug-resistant malaria. And while there's still discussion about the impact of biomarkers of insecticide resistance, there's a lot of data that as you introduce new insecticides, the impact increases dramatically. So the question for you is, how do you include vector tools eagerly into, because there's huge delays in that system? And is there any way to get so that it doesn't all rest on the shoulders of the Gates Foundation? Other regulatory groups that are aligned with countries, whether because they're French-speaking or Portuguese-speaking or have special relationships, to actually engage and further support this? That's one question. For Rajiv, you've worked extensively and historically with pandemic flu. Now you're looking at it from the vaccine business. But the support continuously, repeatedly evaporates once the immediate crisis goes away. We face that with Ebola. Now those resources in the U.S. are being torqued on the way to dealing with Zika. And from the point of view of this forum, which is about partnerships, can you conceive of a partnership structure which would sustain the enterprise in a way that would engage industry as well as the investments that the public sector can't make, neither of whom can hold on to this indefinitely? It's very hard from a market perspective to say, continue investing in something that may never appear again. And then finally, back to the money. My colleague from the World Bank, you've made some astonishingly frank comments about no new source of public funding for SDGs. I think that's how I interpreted it broadly. And then really challenges to use things like the massive subsidy system that exists to ensure public outcomes, which I thought was a fascinating concept, but one which will face intense vested and political interests. I think we all understand the need to present the Minister of Finance, whether it's in our countries or in the South, with the fact that this is a good investment. But we somehow know that, but either don't have the right language or aren't engaging the right people. Do you have advice on how to proceed on that? Because that in itself is a topic of some urgency. Thank you.
All right, so I'll start off with the malaria question, which is a great question, and the hierarchy or the order at which we've been addressing the regulatory issues have been kind of drug vaccines, then diagnostics, and last but not least is the vector space. And I think as you well know, the vector control space is absolutely critical for malaria control and will be critical for malaria eradication. A couple of things. So in January 1st of 2017, the vector control component of the World Health Organization, at least from an approval process or pre-qualification like process, will be under pre-qualification. So it's moving from another area into the pre-qualification, and again, taking advantage of the lessons that have been learned in the drug, vaccine, and diagnostic space and applying those lessons to the vector space. I think it may have worked at one point in its history, but I don't think it's working anymore, and there's a huge need for new active ingredients. The other, as I've dug into this space a little bit more over the last year, the other thing that's going to be critical is how we use insecticides, just like how we use drugs. And you know, a lot of the experts that I've spoken with have talked about the need to rotate, you know, like the insecticide-treated bed nets. And that's going to be a huge change in how we think about doing that. Because if we take the same approach and now we have new great active ingredients for our insecticides and we treat them the same way and we just throw them out there and let everybody use them, you know, in 5 or 10 years, once they're out, we're going to be in exactly the same boat. So I think it's not just thinking about new products, but also thinking about how we use them.
Thanks, Jana, for the question around preparedness. I think on pandemic influenza is a bit different from other emergencies. The world has more experience in thinking through pandemic preparedness, and I think good progress has been made, but there's still a significant gap. If we have an emergence of a pandemic flu virus, there would be some vaccine available, possibly even somewhat quickly, but that vaccine is likely to go to the countries where the manufacturing capacity exists and the countries that are able to pay for the vaccine. The WHO is making some efforts in this area to carve out supply for developing countries, but I think more likely needs to be done. I think the issue of keeping a certain level of R&D and interest in this is very important. And here I think it's the role of governments who are looking out for the public's interest to make the necessary investments to prepare for emerging infectious diseases. And this is a critical issue that the CEPI group is tackling, where there is an expectation that multiple governments as well as foundations will contribute to fund the R&D, as well as companies coming in and making commitments to put the necessary capacity or concept of operations in place to get the capacity, so that you, on the first hand, have candidates in the pipeline that can quickly be taken into phase 3 once a priority pathogen converts to one that's actually producing a public health emergency of international concern. But then secondly, you've got the CONOPS in place through contract manufacturers as well as company capacity that can flex in order to produce enough supply. There will never be a plan that is sufficient to make enough countermeasure for the entire world, but hopefully that aside, if you take pandemic flu off the table, hopefully the likelihood of having something like that with a different pathogen is exceedingly low, although not zero.
So we're coming back to changing philosophy, right? It's a recurrent theme. Derek put it on the table. You're right. 5 years ago, that conversation wouldn't have gone anywhere on the subsidy. Today, the world is different. And I really mean that, because I'm in the middle of these conversations with key actors around the agricultural subsidy situation. And you also partly answered the question yourself, because you asked, are we having the right conversation? Are we having the right narrative? And the answer is, we need to change the narrative. The past narrative was agricultural subsidies are wasteful, inefficient, mostly politically motivated to get votes, et cetera, and please certain interest groups. Today, the conversation, and therefore get rid of them, because they're no good. That didn't get anybody anywhere in the last 40 years, right? Zero success. So that's not a good narrative to have. It's not a conversation to have. It's not following the 7 points here, et cetera. You got to look at this differently. Today, we are saying, the world invests today $500 billion into its farming community and into that sector. Is it getting the return that it could get from that amount of money? And of course, the answer is no. So the conversation now is not do away with these subsidies. The conversation is the world really needs this investment, but it needs to get a different return. And you would not believe how well that resonates in quarters that if you would have continued the same conversation, didn't get you anywhere, how this completely changes the discussion. Phil Hogan, who is currently the EU Agricultural Commissioner, sort of in charge of the 60 billion euros that the Europeans give to their farmers, is totally open to that conversation, and in fact, it is beginning to shift. Today already, 23% of that money, 60 billion, is actually getting returns of a public goods nature. The EU has, in its agricultural sector, in just the past decade, reduced its emissions coming out of the ag sector by 20+%. So the conversation with him now is not, get rid of your subsidies. The conversation is, why are you not spending 80% of your money getting that kind of outcome rather than 20%, and how fast can you get there with all the political shenanigans involved? And it's a very constructive conversation, and I feel, I really feel optimistic that within a decade, we will see this shift dramatically. We have the same conversation with the Chinese. We have the same conversation in India. All the big players, including here with Tom Vilsack, who is absolutely open-minded about this. If it's politically doable, and the point is you can give the same amount of money to the same farmer, but you give it for something different. You give it for a biogas digester, or you give it for changing your production practices so that you reduce the footprint, or you give it for a diversified diet outcome. Right now, 80% of the world's subsidies in agriculture go to 5 crops only. Nutritional outcomes not very good if you just focus on rice, wheat, and corn. right? So it's actually detrimental to nutritional outcomes, the current subsidies. But why can't we subsidize or invest in diversified agriculture? The farmers would love that if they would get support for that, if they could diversify, it reduces their risk, et cetera, et cetera. So the issue is really around the narrative. Get the narrative right, understand what really is a win-win-win for everybody, and then you can shift even big things that were taboo for decades. So I feel very optimistic about that one.
So I know before we began, none of you thought how exciting the regulatory environment was. But please join me in thanking our panelists for making it so.
Let me add my thanks. That was it was very stimulating and a lot of opportunity there for our discussion. So let me just remind everyone the plan after the break, which we will take now for about 15 minutes. This workshop is one of two. It was designed that way on purpose, which is we wanted to really, in our last session, the one coming up, is think about all that we've talked about, both in the history of the working of the forum, but also around public-private partnerships. We said we wanted to start with public-private partnerships 201, not 101. So we want to really kind of move through that part of the background and then what we've discussed in the last couple of days to inform a discussion over the next hour or a little bit more perhaps on page 63 to 65, 66. This was the framework sort of straw person that was put up by the staff to have a further discussion in preparation for our October workshop, which we hope we made efforts at this time. We're not able, we want to thank the Norwegian ambassador, we're not able to get the full voice of the other end of the partnerships here, but we want to try to do that in October, having the meeting in Europe, and encourage everyone to put their minds to that over the next 15 minutes. But what we would do, we will sort of stop the live streaming part of this conversation because we want to really function more as a working group so people don't feel like they have to turn their mics off and on and, you know, say something in a different way. Not that it's not public, it's still quite public, and we invite our colleagues who are here that are not members of the forum to participate actively in this next phase of the work. But we will be addressing that issue of pulling these elements together on the framework, and we'll start that. Going to have Derek, I think after the break, perhaps give us a brief report from the compact. Renuka and I were asked to come up with some takeaways before we started this morning, but in the interest of time delayed that, and then we'll launch into this discussion, which I'll try to facilitate for about an hour after that point, and the staff will be taking copious notes, and the plan would be to pull together a draft that would then go to forum members for their comment, and similarly Rachel will be soliciting, as she did yesterday, repeating in a quick email to all of those of our colleagues who were not able to stay for this session to get their comments, and then they'll be putting something together for all of us to look at, okay? So let me invite you to take a break. We'll come back at 25 of, that's 15-minute break.